And Val's going to tie it all together for us.
Actually, there was a lot in that that made me think of other things, but the mention of the Minet balls, they were developed by the French, and it was a cartridge with a pointed end, and they were so damaging. A man whose arm or leg was shot with one of those lost it for good reason. It wasn't just that they couldn't do the things we can do now with wounds. It was because they tended to put enormous holes in people. And actually one of the most famous people shot and died after amputation was Stonewall Jackson after the Battle at Chancellorsville. But he actually died of pneumonia about a week after the battle. The hospitals, they made incredible advances during the war as far as understanding or learning about germs and keeping things clean and so forth. And by the end of the war, there were 350 Union hospitals in Washington, D.C. alone, taking care of the wounded. So probably largely from Northern Virginia and the battles going on there. When the Union reached Atlanta, it was already burning. In fact, it was General John Bell Hood who set Atlanta on fire and was destroying as much as he could because he couldn't take it with him. He didn't want to leave any supplies, any munitions for the Union forces to use. So that was part of that. They, in fact, before the Union troops entered, they could hear the explosions within the city, those of the 31st of August and so forth. The 123rd Regiment was among the first of the people to enter, first of the Union forces to enter the city. And when they did that, they had marched some 400 miles since October of 1863, when they had reached Tennessee. Sherman's army remained in Atlanta until mid-November. Once the election was over and so forth, they began the march to the sea. When it mentioned Lincoln's overwhelming re-election, he had 55% of the popular vote. But of course, no southern states were included in that. And he had won in the northern states, still in the Union, he had won all but 3 of them. So it was a huge turnaround for him. In addition, in 1864, you also had General Philip Sheridan in the Shenandoah Valley here in Virginia, just destroying everything. It was a huge farm area, a lot of small farms, but very productive, very fertile ground, and they just wiped everything out. So you have both of those victories, or the action here plus down in Atlanta. When the men started out from Atlanta, Sherman basically divided the force in, his major force in two. 62,000 men headed to the sea, another 60,000 were still heading more or less this way to deal with Johnston's army and so forth. Of the 62,000, they were divided again into two columns about 30 miles apart that then went towards Savannah. And they did destroy everything they could find. Well, we've got, okay. I think the route, oh, that's interesting. My state lines went through to the back. Roughly, you've got an interstate here, but it's roughly the same kind of road or route down to Savannah. One of the things they did was to take railroad ties and put them, make fires out of them, and then put the rails over them. Then they would pick them up by the ends and wrap them around trees, and they called these Sherman's neckties because they didn't want the Southerners to be able to take the rails and reuse them. They were totally ruined. They had men with each regiment called bummers, who were basically the guys who went out and scavenged. They found any animals they could for food, they found anything. The Army had to create its own food sources. They were no longer getting supplied. Most of the war, the North did a terrific job with food, although at one point a lot of it was simply in warehouses in Washington, D.C. It wasn't getting to the soldiers. In their basic supply daily would be 9 kind of like hardtack crackers. They were about this big, kind of like giant saltines. They would get coffee at various times. They'd have different kinds of meat. There were peddlers who tended to follow the troops, and they often would sell salt pork, bacon, all kinds of things. But when it got to Atlanta and so forth, they were kind of on their own. By December, mid-December, they had reached Savannah, and they stopped about 10 days, about December 11th, I think it was. Savannah was kind of surrounded by rice paddies, rice fields. So they couldn't, and there were about 10,000 Confederate troops in Savannah protecting it. Well, they just kind of waited, and then one night, all of the Confederates just kind of left. And on the 21st, Sherman had control of Savannah, sent Lincoln a telegram basically telling him it was his Christmas gift, the city of Savannah. So from there, in fact, there's a house in Savannah that is the residence where Sherman lived while they were there for almost a month. In January, they left, they headed north. They really didn't do much as far as destruction in Savannah. Once they got into South Carolina, though, that's where they really let loose. South Carolina had been the first state to secede in December of 1860, sorry. And they were blamed for starting the whole thing off. So there was a lot of destruction, Charleston and the whole area. They went on up into North Carolina, and I have to flip the map back over. They reached North Carolina in March of 1865, and in mid-March they finally got resupplied with clothing. You know, we see movies like the video we just saw, and they're always in these great uniforms, except the truth was, by the time they were fighting these battles, their uniforms were often in pretty bad shape. The North had better supplies in general, plus the industry in the North had kept things going, but the Southerners often were not really in uniforms that looked like uniforms at all. And, you know, the Northerners' pants were often tattered. They were almost like shorts or capris or something. They were lucky if they still had shoes. So they finally got new uniforms and were able to march back through North Carolina. And their last official battle was something called Bentonville, which wasn't far from Raleigh. And it was the last official battle for the 123rd. But about 3 weeks later, there was a skirmish at a place called Moccasin Creek, where the very last man to be killed in the regiment died. April 12th, they learned that General Lee had surrendered to Grant, which had occurred 3 days earlier. And the next day, they moved into Raleigh. The 123rd went into Raleigh, North Carolina, along with Sherman's men. 3 days later, they learned that General Johnston surrendered. Lee had surrendered, but it didn't really stop all the fighting. Once Johnston surrendered, that really made a huge difference. And then April 17th, again about 3 days after the fact, they learned of Lincoln's assassination and started marching toward Washington, D.C. They reached Richmond, Virginia, May 11th, and then May 15th, were back at the site of Chancellorsville, where they found some of the bodies of their fellow soldiers had actually been uncovered. That wasn't the first time either. There was another battle in that area earlier where the Union had discovered a lot of the men hadn't been buried that deep and weren't that well covered, and that tended to be washed away, and then they were left with skulls and bones. Anyway, they reburied dead in Chancellorsville and moved on to Washington, D.C. And in May 24th, they were at the head of Sherman's army as they passed in review before Sherman, President Johnson, General Grant, and other dignitaries. June 9th, they left Washington, headed north. They reached New York City, where they transferred from a train to a steamer to go up the Hudson to Albany, and June 14th had their final release from the military.
Questions? Any questions?
So how long would it take them to get news? Like,
Because of the telegraph, often just a matter of 2 or 3 days. It was kind of amazing. The North also did a fantastic job with the mail. If men didn't get mail from home, it wasn't that the mail wasn't getting through, it was that people weren't writing. It was just phenomenal from what I've read. And some of them, of course, were illiterate. One way to make money if you knew how to read and write was to write letters for other soldiers and they'd pay you for it. So.
Questions?
All of the dead that fell in these various locations and were buried on the spot, did they go back after and disinter them and bring them home? Or are there still bodies buried in fields all through the South?
Well, as you saw in the film, they showed a cemetery
Right.
near Kennesaw Mountain. And that's a huge cemetery. A lot of the dead were brought to that cemetery,
They were.
both Confederate and Union soldiers. Some did come home. Colonel McDougal came home. But I'm sure there were probably bodies still buried out there. If they were buried on the field, then they were never discovered.
I know I remember hearing, now how many years ago this was, I can't remember, at least 10, that a body was discovered in Gettysburg. I mean, people who live in Gettysburg still find bullets and other things when they're digging in the garden. Stuff just shows up. But they found a body and they couldn't determine if he was a Confederate or a Union, and they wanted to rebury him. So they basically kind of buried him in the cemetery, sort of where the two meet. So he wasn't definitely one or the other. But I'm sure they're still out there.
Just one final comment about the 123rd. Val mentioned that when they did the Grand Parade in Washington, D.C., the 123rd led that parade. They were always known as Sherman's pets.
Yes.
Because they were the lead regiment in that particular corps. But what that also meant that they went out first on the skirmish. It wasn't mentioned in this film as being the 123rd, but when they mentioned the skirmish going out, it would be the men from the 123rd, because their tactics were a little different than we'll go stand out on the field and shoot at each other. They were more of a ranger tactic that we know today, and that's how they were used throughout the war. They always went out first. Edie, do you have anything to add? You've
That
looked
was
at all the
wonderful. Thank you
research
so
on
much,
this.
John. That was very interesting.
I'm just curious to know, how is it that the 123rd is getting a monument in Georgia?
Well, I told you that this, you may have noticed in the credits, it said the Georgia Reenactors Organization. There's a huge organization in Georgia of reenactors, and they do both Confederates and Union. And this particular Confederate group decided they wanted to do the 123rd because it was the 123rd that fought at Resaca. If you read Cruikshank's material, he wrote a long poem about the Battle of Resaca and what happened in Resaca to the 123rd. So perhaps it was just happenstance, but there was a battlefield that nobody was taking care of, so they decided they would do that. And as they worked on it, they said, oh, the 123rd was here. In fact, they chose Company D. Why they chose D, I don't know, but that's Company D of the 123rd that they reenact. Anything else? Thank you for coming. Appreciate it.